On the early night of October 11th, 1973, two colleagues, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker Jr., were out fishing by the Pascagoula River in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Suddenly, Hickson heard what he described as a weird buzzing sound behind him. When he turned around, he was faced with an egg-shaped object with two big bluish lights illuminating the front. It was estimated to be 9 to 12 meters long, 2.5 to 3 meters high. The object was hovering just above the water, a meter or so from where the two men were standing. After a short time, a door opened, and three strange beings began floating towards the two men. The creatures were among some of the most unique ever reported by contactees. Charles Hickson would later do his best to describe them.
They had seemed to come directly to the shoulders, and they had something that resembled a nose on a face, and about where ears would be was something that was similar to the nose, only it was a little longer. It seemed to come out almost to a point. And under the nose it was something like a slit for a mouth, and it was very wrinkled. And it appeared to me to be something like an elephant skin, but I don't know where it was a metal or what it was, but it seemed to be very wrinkles with the wrinkles running horizontal. And in the area where the eyes should have been, it was so wrinkled that I'm not even sure there was eyes. I can't recall whether there was any eyes or not, and Calvin says he can't.
He also reported that they had claw-like hands and seemed to be just over 1.5 meters tall. Hickson later speculated that the creatures may have been robots, since he could not recall them having any visible or audible effects of breathing. After hovering to where the men were standing, two of the beings grabbed Hickson, while a third took care of Parker, who had fainted. They made their way to a bright-lit room inside the UFO, where Hickson was left floating, as if laying on an invisible bed. He could not move any part of his body, except his eyes. A strange device which looked like a big, almond-shaped robotic eye went over his body, as if it was scanning him. After the device retracted, Hickson was left alone for some time, presumably because the beings were then tending to Parker. Eventually, Hickson was floated back onto the pier where Parker stood, seemingly in shock. Then, the object rose straight into the sky and flew away quietly. Hickson later estimated that the whole ordeal took no more than 20 minutes. After the incident, the two men sat in Hickson's car, trying to calm themselves and make sense of what just happened. They were afraid of public ridicule and were unsure of whether or not they should tell someone. After some time, they began thinking of what could happen if the creatures had malevolent intentions. What if other people in the area were being abducted? What if this was happening elsewhere and was a threat to national security? They decided to contact Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. The sergeant who answered their phone call told them that the Air Force no longer officially investigated UFOs. They were instructed to contact their local sheriff department instead. Hickson and Parker drove a long way to the Jackson County, Mississippi Sheriff's Office, where they met Sheriff Fred Diamond and Captain Glenn Ryder, who conducted interviews with the two men. Sheriff Diamond was understandably skeptic of their story, and was looking for signs of hoaxing. Still, the men, in particular Parker, seemed genuinely frightened and disturbed, and he decided to get to the bottom of it. After being interviewed separately, Parker and Hickson were placed together in a room, which, unbeknownst to them, was wired for sound. There they talked privately. Their conversations were recorded and a tape was produced, which the sheriff suspected would prove the story to be a hoax. To his amazement, he discovered that the two men acted even more disturbed than when they were talking to the authorities, one by one. After their interviews at the sheriff's office, Hickson and Parker decided to keep quiet about the event. They went to work the following morning. Stressed and sleep-deprived, they went through their workdays without a mention of what they had experienced the previous night. A few hours after punching in, Sheriff Fred Diamond called the men at work, informing them that reporters were questioning him, trying to uncover more information about the extraordinary event. Despite their best efforts to keep the story under wraps, the mainstream media was quickly alerted to the case. Much to the dismay of the two men, their abduction story was being spread across the globe in a matter of days. Their hometown of Gautier, Mississippi, suddenly became a hotbed of astronomers, reporters, UFO enthusiasts, and independent researchers. While already under much stress due to the overwhelming media attention, the two men also became concerned about a possible radiation exposure during their encounter inside the flying object. They initially requested to be checked at a local hospital, but they lacked the necessary equipment. Instead, they ended up at Keesler Air Force Base, the very same facility which had turned them down when they first reported their experience. There, they were thoroughly examined by several medical professionals who found no signs of radiation poisoning. Following the radiation test, the military intelligence chief of the base requested to meet with them. Both Parker and Hickson were interviewed by him while many others observed the proceedings. Later, an Air Force artist also made a sketch of one of the creatures, based on Hickson's recollection. The Pascagoula incident also gained the attention of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, a UFO research group which consisted of many scientists and put much emphasis on scientific field investigations. They sent James A. Harder, a University of California engineering professor, to investigate the case. He teamed up with the famed Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who represented the US Air Force, and together they interviewed Hickson and Parker extensively. Harder attempted to perform regressive hypnosis on Charles Hickson, but the session was interrupted as he became too terrified to continue. Additionally, both Hickson and Parker took polygraph tests, which they passed. After their investigations, both Harder and Hynek concluded that both of the contactees were telling the truth. J. Allen Hynek later stated in an interview,
I went down to Pascagoula completely negative, but I worked with those men for quite a while. I listened to tapes that had been taken when they didn't know they were being taped. I saw how Charlie behaved under hypnosis, and finally the lie detector test. All of those things convinced me that he was not making it up. They had had an experience, period.
The Pascagoula incident is also briefly mentioned in the channeled work The Law of One, also known as the Ra material. According to this material, supposedly relayed by highly evolved ETs, the beings who contacted Hickson and Parker were from the Sirius star system. They were peaceful vegetation-like life forms, which evolved from something similar to a tree, which will explain their appearance and lack of noticeable breathing. It further states that the beings were recording the life experience of Charles Hickson in order to learn, taking a special interest in his war experiences. These entities were mostly existing in a near meditative state, and a life of constant movement and aggressive behavior, such as ours, were foreign to them. Consequently, to them, Hickson's mind became a valuable subject of contemplation. In the years following the event, Calvin Parker Jr. mostly avoided the public eye. He was rather negatively affected by what happened and struggled with sleep deprivation and anxiety. At one point he was even hospitalized due to an emotional breakdown. Hickson, while cautious at first, eventually learned to accept his role in the spotlight. He initially appeared on television shows like The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and The Dick Cavett Show. Later, he went on to co-author a book with William Mendez about his experience, titled UFO Contact at Pascagoula. He also directed a documentary called In Contact, and did numerous conferences and radio interviews. On September the 9th, 2011, Charles Hickson passed away at the age of 80. His story is, to this day, one of the most intriguing and believable abduction cases of modern times. Despite ridicule and frequent stress, Hickson always stood by his word. His fascinating story remained the same until the day he died.